Okay, welcome to another edition of our Blackfoot history program here at Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park. My name is Grant Manyheads. In Blackfoot, my name is Enki, which translates to singer. That's what I am, and that's how I learned my history. So with that, let's actually go into the program. Now, before we actually start with the history program, let's talk about who the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples are. Now, if you look up on there, you could see the symbol, and this is the symbol of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Or in our language, we say Siksikaitsitapiiks, which literally translates to the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples. Now, in the North American continent, there are 4 tribes, or nations, that make up the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples. And here you can see the symbol. Now, there are 4 tribes, like I said, and the first one we'll begin with is the Piikani. Now, in English, that was kind of mistranslated pagan. So, pagan is actually not correct. The true name for this tribe is Piikani. And if you were to translate that into English, that would translate as scabby robes. Now, there's a story behind that. At one time, these people were tanning the hides for clothing, and they were attacked by an enemy tribe. And they had to pick up their hides, and they had to flee to safety. And the story is once they were safe, they unrolled their hides and began the process of re-tanning them. But by that time, a lot of the flesh had hardened and a lot of the grease and such. So when they did finally finish tanning these hides, they didn't look very nice. So other tribesmen or other people from our nation saw these people, and this is probably thousands and thousands of years ago, but they saw these people and saw the clothes that they were wearing, and they saw that they were actually really poorly tanned hides. So they start calling them the scabby robe people or the shabby robe people. And the name kind of stuck, or it stayed with them. So over the years, these people have been called the Piikani, but it doesn't mean that that's how their clothes are to this day. They actually have beautiful clothes just like everybody else, but at that time, that's how they got their start. So that's where the word Piikani comes from. And they're just 1/4 of all the Blackfoot speaking peoples on this continent. Now actually, this next tribe are the Siksika. If you were to translate that into English, that would translate as Blackfoot. So that's who the Siksika people are. And the story about the Blackfoot people is that some of these people in ancient times were walking across the prairies, and there was a fire. So by the time that they finished walking through this burnt prairie grass, their moccasins, which are usually lightly tanned, or maybe like a beige almost, now they were black. And then these other Blackfoot people, or other tribesmen, they noticed the color of their moccasins and start calling those people Blackfoot. And that name stuck with those people. So up until this day, that part of the tribe of the Blackfoot speaking peoples are known as Blackfoot. So just for those of you who never knew that before. Now, we talked about the Piikani earlier, but this tribe here, or this nation, this is the nation that exists in the United States of America today, in the state of Montana. Now, the Americans call these people Blackfeet. That's wrong. We don't have a word for Blackfeet. They're actually known as the Amskapi Piikani to the other Blackfoot nations. And Amskapi means across. And in this case, it means across the border. So the border is actually a brand new thing to the Blackfoot people. It didn't exist in most of our existence up until 1812, when the British and the Americans put the border in. And when the border was put in, it separated those Piikani living in the northern parts from those Piikani living in the southern parts. So those southern Piikani are what we call Amskapi Piikani and what the Americans call Blackfeet. So just so you know, so let's look at the 4th member of the Confederacy. Now this is the Blood Tribe. Now that's actually a nickname. The other Blackfoot tribes know these people as Agena, or many chiefs, or many leaders. And that's how we know this sister tribe as. But in ancient times, we also knew them as Effects Firewater, or that would mean, basically would translate to the white weasel skin or the white weasel pelt people, because apparently they had a lot of this white weasel pelts in their clothes. So they were known for that by other Blackfoot tribes. But altogether, these 4 tribes make up the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples, or the Siksikaitsitapiiks. But today, they're better known as the Blackfoot Confederacy. So here in this image, you see the 4 tribes in North America, the 4 nations that make up the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples. So let's actually move on to the next image. Now, this is a map of Gitawasan, and that means our homeland as Blackfoot Speaking Peoples. Now, if you were to take a look at that particular map, you'll see that if you're starting from the west, you're actually starting from the Rocky Mountains, or what most people know as the Rocky Mountains. But to the Blackfoot people, we call that Mistakkists, and that means the backbone of the earth. So from the backbone of the earth all the way east to practically the the province of Manitoba. And that's at the end of the Qu'Appelle, kind of up in the Qu'Appelle Valley, Touchwood Hills, Carrot River region, just before you go into Manitoba down into the Canadian Shield area. Well, that's as far east as the Blackfoot tribes went, the Blackfoot nations, and from the North Saskatchewan River, where present-day Rocky Mountain House, Edmonton, Batoche, Prince Albert, all the way south to the Yellowstone River in the state of Montana, in the United States of America. So you can see all the lands in between are what our people considered Gitawasan, or our homeland. Now let's actually begin the history lesson from here. In 1865, now there was a number of things that happened in 1865 that had a direct impact on the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples. Now for one, that was the end of the American Civil War between the North and the South in the United States of America. But at the end of that war, there were a lot of homeless, and a lot of those homeless made their way west. And in doing so, they came into Blackfoot country. Now a lot of these people came up the Missouri River on a steamboat, because at that time the steamboat could go as far as Fort Benton on the Missouri River, and that's just before the Great Falls of Montana. So this steamboat could go as far as Fort Benton, and unlike the British, the Hudson Bay Company, who were shipping their goods and shipping down their goods with canoes on the North Saskatchewan River, while in the United States of America, on the Missouri, the steamboat was able to ship down hundreds of thousands of furs and buffalo robes, and they're also able to ship upstream lots of supplies for the miners, for the people that were settling in the region, and also they're able to bring up all the ingredients and materials they needed for whiskey warehouses and all of these things, and tens of thousands of miners and prospectors and settlers all coming up the steamboat. So all of this was happening after 1862, particularly after 1865. More and more white men were coming into the Blackfoot lands, especially in Fort Benton, which actually was on Blackfoot land, but at the very far southern border, if you want to call it that, of the Blackfoot lands, right on the Missouri. So in 1865, other than the Civil War coming to an end, well, a man named Choto, who owned the American Fur Company, well, now this man died. And when he died, the American Fur Company basically dissolved. And when that dissolved, it was replaced by hundreds of traders who picked up that slack that the American Fur Company created when they left or when they folded. So this American Fur Company, it actually did a number of things. It was like the Hudson Bay Company or like the Northwest Company. They sold liquor to the natives, but they only sold enough liquor to entice the natives to come for trade. They did not flood the market, so to speak. So the thing is, a lot of native peoples, the only taste of liquor they would get was when they visited the forts, maybe once or twice a year. Even in the United States, the Blackfoot only visited the American Fur Company maybe once or twice a year to trade our furs, get some trade goods, maybe go on a 2 or 3 day bender, getting drunk, and then back to life, back to hunting the buffalo like we always did. So the American Fur Company sort of controlled the liquor. But once they dissolved and they were gone, well, those controls were gone. Now with those hundreds of traders, they had no morals, nor did they have any qualms about selling liquor to the natives, even though it was illegal. So at that same time, these hundreds of free traders, they weren't necessarily selling good whiskey to the Blackfoot. Now you have to understand that the Blackfoot knew what good whiskey was. We bought it from the French, we bought it from the British. We drank the same whiskey that they drank. Maybe it was watered down, but it was still the same whiskey. Now the Americans were different. They didn't sell us whiskey most of the time. Most of the time they sold us rot-gut firewater. Now this was clear alcohol that they were mixing with water and putting in these huge kegs or vats. And then they would try and sell that to the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot wouldn't buy it because it looked too much like water. So they had to fool the Blackfoot into thinking they were buying high wines like brandy, like good whiskey, like wines. And so what they would do is they would take adulterants, and a lot of these adulterants were poisonous. They would take in regular chewing tobacco. They would take in regular tobacco. They would throw in the actual element copper, which is poisonous. It's a metal. They would throw this into that concoction, and they would take things like Hofstadter bitters, ginger, peppers, anything that would give it kick, and they would throw it into this mixture, and they would mix like a witch's brew. And then this is what they would sell to the Blackfoot. A 35 cent of this rot-gut firewater whiskey to make, it equaled a buffalo robe you could sell in St. Louis for $16, $17. So if you were to do the math, $3.50 could make you $170. Those are huge profits now. If you think about in those times, 1865, those are incredible profits. That's why all the people were coming up into the west of America, which was Blackfoot country, to try and make their fortunes, because there was so much money to be made. Now these firewater concoctions or recipes, literally there were hundreds of traders out there with hundreds of different recipes, and all of it was for this rot-gut firewater whiskey that they were selling to the Blackfoot, trying to pass off as real whiskey. So these American whiskey traders weren't like our British and French friends. The Blackfoot went to visit them once or twice a year on the North Saskatchewan River. They didn't come down onto Blackfoot lands to disrupt our way of life. The Americans were different. Wherever the Blackfoot were camped, these traders went right into our camps, and they sold us their trade goods. But more often than not, their main stock in trade was this rot-gut firewater whiskey that they were selling. So this was the bad time for the Blackfoot. From 1865 right up until 1870, in the United States of America, this whiskey trade took root. It was actually the cause of what they called the Blackfoot War. Now this was another event that happened in 1865, right up until 1870. There was so much violence that came because of this legal Blackfoot, or not Blackfoot, but a legal whiskey trade with the Blackfoot, that a lot of violence erupted. And there were sides, even chosen by the white men. There were those people who were against the whiskey trade, and then there were those in the town of Benton who were for it because they were making their profits. So there was a lot of unrest going on in that part of the Blackfoot territory then in the United States of America. Now this Blackfoot War, it was vicious, and most people don't talk about it, but some Blackfoot people going into the town on one particular occasion, 4 of them were hung in the town of Benton, and a sign was put on them that basically said that these were 4 good Blackfoot. They were all dead, and 2 of them were old men and 2 of them were their grandsons. But that seriously enraged the Blackfoot living in that region, and that's when Chief Bullhead actually went through and burnt down all the US government farms, killed some of the herdsmen and some of the people there, all because of this. And this is all around that same time, these Blackfoot Wars, and all of it was because of this illegal, illicit whiskey trade that began in the United States of America. So let's actually move on to the next image. So here's another image of how vicious this Blackfoot War was. Here you see natives, Blackfoots, bringing in the head of a troublemaker just to appease the US Army so that they don't attack a Blackfoot camp. And this was right throughout the 1865, right up until 1870. And interestingly enough, from that time period, from 1865 to 1870, the U.S. Army did not at any time attack the Blackfoot people because they didn't place the blame of this on the Blackfoot. They knew it was their own settlers that were causing all of this. But because there was more and more settlers and this situation arose, in time the United States Army had to take a different look at the Blackfoot and the situation. And that culminated in an attack on the Blackfoot people in 1870. But we'll talk about that in a bit. But this is when it actually started, when the whiskey trade started in 1865. So let's move on to the next image. So during this time, by 1867, this whiskey trade, it had left the Missouri River and it started making its way north. So now it's going to the Sun River, it's going to the Marias River. So now the whiskey trade is slowly leaving Fort Benton and it's making its way farther north into Blackfoot territory. This isn't going south or even west into the mountains. This is going north from Fort Benton into Blackfoot territory. And you have to remember, even in the United States at this time, selling liquor on native lands was illegal. That was the Intercourse Law of 1832. In the United States of America, which made selling liquor to native peoples illegal. But this whole town, as late as 1867, was thriving on the whiskey trade that was coming from the Blackfoot speaking peoples. So let's move on to the next image. Now, in 1862, like I mentioned, the steamboat traffic, that's when the steamboat was able to make it as far as Fort Benton, the farthest inland post in the world. Because from the Gulf of Mexico, you can now travel up the Mississippi River, and when you get to the Missouri River, you can take the Missouri River all the way towards the mountains practically. And when you're making that journey, you're eventually going to bump into the Great Falls of the Missouri. And that's as far upriver as you can go. So it was right there that they set up this Fort Benton. So in 1862, the steamboat made its way to Fort Benton, but by 1867, 2 years after the Civil War, now there are tens of thousands of people coming up the Missouri to settle in Fort Benton, and they're coming up by increased steamboats. Now it's not just maybe 3 or 4 steamboats making the trip. Now there's hundreds of steamboats that are making their way up into Fort Benton. And during this time, they're bringing up all of the ingredients you need to make whiskey, to make buildings, to create warehouses. And so by the spring of 1868, there's a new rush of homesteaders. So now there's even more people living right at the southern edge of Blackfoot territory. So let's actually move on. So it was during this time that Baker and Power, the 2 big whiskey traders, set up shop. So at this time, it's interesting to note, now let's actually talk about Mountain Chief. Now, the whiskey trade had already started. So there's a lot of whiskey traders making their way to where the Blackfoot camps are to sell their whiskey. Now at this time, the Blackfoot people, they noticed this. And usually in times past, the Blackfoot, when we visited the whiskey posts, we would go, like I mentioned earlier, maybe once or twice a year. And when we went there, the market wasn't flooded with alcohol. It was just enough to entice us there and maybe have a 2 or 3 day bender, but then that was it. That was all the alcohol or liquor that was sold to us. So our people became accustomed to this. So over 100 years, from about 1778 or 1780 right up until 1870, our people were used to this type of trade. We visit the forts once, twice a year, stay there for 2 or 3 days, maybe go on a drunk, and then we come back to what we always do, hunting the buffalo, living the way we always did. So chiefs such as Mountain Chief, they were used to this way of going to the white man's forts to trade. But now, because these traders are coming into Blackfoot camps, Mountain Chief was very, very much against that. And in fact, he pled for the whiskey traders to stay in Fort Benton, and that the Blackfoot would go to Fort Benton like we did in times past and trade like we always did in the past. He did not want these traders coming out to the Blackfoot camps. As he put it, he said, there's nothing in common between us. Let's just meet like we did in the past. and you stay where you are, we'll stay where we are. But they didn't listen to him. In fact, he actually went into the town of Fort Benton, and he went up to the Indian agent to express these concerns to him, and he was roughed out and basically forced out of town at gunpoint. So even a man as reasonable as Mountain Chief, not wanting the whiskey to infect our people the way it was, he tried to put a stop to it, and he asked politely for the American officials to stop their people from coming onto Blackfoot lands to sell this rot gut. But they didn't listen. So they tried to appease him, and they figured, okay, well, maybe we'll put a stop to the hundreds of whiskey traders, and we'll just allow 2 licensed traders to trade with the Blackfoot. And the U.S. government figured they could put a stop to these unlicensed whiskey traders. That's not actually what happened. At that time, when they set up these licensed whiskey posts, well, they would sell everything minus liquor, our firewater, but none of the Blackfoot would go to these places, at least not the whole tribe, because as these permanent posts were set up, the other whiskey traders who were doing it illegally would see where they set up their posts, and then they would wait for the Blackfoot to go visit these posts. And before the Blackfoot could get to those posts, the whiskey traders would hit up the Blackfoot along the way and get them to sell their robes and things for trade goods and mostly for liquor. So these licensed trading posts really didn't work in the United States of America. They only had 2 as far as we know, and neither of those posts made any money because of the unlicensed whiskey traders. And that's what these people are in this image here. You could see that these are just regular people living in the town of Benton, and they're coming up, putting up their canvas tents, and they know these trade routes. They know where these licensed trading posts are. And they would lie in wait, and they would just wait along the path that they knew the Blackfoot were taking to go visit these posts. And as the Blackfoot people started coming in to do their trading, these people would intercept them, and then they would sell everything that they had, which included all of this rot gut firewater whiskey. So these posts were actually more popular to the people than the licensed trading posts. So these unlicensed whiskey traders actually made more money. And so the licensed traders were actually very upset with the fact that the government was not able to put a stop to these unlicensed whiskey traders. And in fact, these unlicensed whiskey traders, they were selling liquor illegally, but the people who were supplying them in Fort Benton, and that was mainly T.J. Powers and I.G. Baker, these 2 people were getting incredibly rich off of this whiskey trade, because all of these illegal whiskey traders were getting their supply from those 2 main contractors in the town of Fort Benton. So a lot of this whiskey trade spread from the Missouri all the way out to the Marias River and the Teton Rivers. And this is awfully close to the British possessions. So let's move on to the next image, and here we are. So there was a licensed trader. His name was John Ripplinger. He actually was married to the former wife of Alexander Culbertson, who was the main factor at American Fur Company in Fort Benton up until the time that it dissolved. And his wife was a lady named Natawista. That's actually not even a real Blackfoot word. I think it's a kind of a shortened form of a name, but Natawista, as she was known, she was actually the sister of the great blood chief seen from afar. And so she was married to Alexander Culbertson, and for the longest time they enjoyed a good trading relationship with the Blackfoot and with the Americans. But by 1850, at the time of Fort Benton, then that violence, especially after the Civil War, it spread. And then so at this time she had left her husband, who was still very much involved in that trade, and she married this man, John Ripplinger of the Northwest Fur Company. And she traveled with him as far as the British North America. And then she left him and went back to the blood people and spent the rest of her days with her people. And that's the interesting thing. I think she felt maybe a little bit of shame over the fact that her people were so badly treated, especially during that time they called the Blackfoot Wars. But all of this was because of the unlicensed whiskey trade, or because of the whiskey trade. So by this time we have John Ripplinger, and this is just before 1869. He moves his wagons as close as you can to the British possessions, which is north of the 49th parallel. Let's actually move on to the next image. So here we have a harbinger of things to come. So Ripplinger set up just in a place called Red Coulee, and that's not even far from the British possessions. And it was from there that he realized that there's not just Blackfoot living south of the border in the United States of America, but there's still a whole lot of Blackfoot people living north of that border. So in time, people started to look north of the border to set up trading posts. So let's actually move on to the next image. Now in the autumn of 1868, this man named John McClellan, he organized an expedition from Fort Benton, and this actually went all the way on the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains into the British possessions, right up to the North Saskatchewan. So these people were looking for gold, and they never did find any other than a few panfuls, maybe up around the Porcupine Hills area, as they state, but they did not find any gold. And in fact, the closer they got to the North Saskatchewan, they wanted to resupply at Hudson Bay Company, Fort Edmonton, but the Hudson Bay Company would not sell them anything. So a little bit angry about that, they left and they made their way back to the United States of America. Well, one of the people in this particular expedition, where they kind of got to know some of the Blackfoot lands, particularly east of the Rocky Mountains, was a member of this expedition, and his name was Joe Healy. Now, Joe Healy, when he got back, he knew that there was still a lot of Blackfoot people that were living north of the 49th parallel, and also he knew that there was still maybe a lot of places that he could find gold, but he'd need a base closer or in the British possessions. So it was that time that he went back into Fort Benton and he spoke to his brother, and that's the person that we know better as John J. Healy. So let's actually move on to the next image. Now, these people, when they went into the British possessions, they saw a lot of places that no white man had ever been before, like the Waterton Lakes and maybe even up to Banff, up into the headwaters of the Red Deer River, of the Bow River. Well, when they went up there, they realized, like I said, that there's a lot of native peoples that they could be trading with. So he actually convinced his brother, J.J. Healy, to set up shop in the British possessions. And so that's what they did. These people managed to get themselves together, and then they made their way from Fort Benton, from the Sun River, all the way into the British possessions. So let's move on to the next image, actually. So here's John J. Healy. So in 1869, this man, Healy, and his brother, they formed the Saskatchewan Mining, Prospecting, and Trading Outfit, and their express purpose for creating this company was to go into the British possessions. Now that's what we know as Canada today. And to the Blackfoot people, this was still our homeland, Kitawasanu. But to the white people, they had already put that line in, like I mentioned, in 1812. So now there's British and American. So now these people, where the whiskey trade was predominantly in the United States of America, now these people are making their way north. So in the winter of 1869, they actually leave the United States of America, cross the 49th parallel, and end up near present-day Lethbridge, where they set up Fort Hamilton, which was actually the first Fort Whoopop. So these are the two men that actually made that journey. Well, you know, during this time, there was a number of things that were happening that were to affect the Blackfoot on a huge scale. And one of them was the smallpox epidemic. Now, this came from the steamboats coming up on the Missouri, coming up to Fort Benton. Now, we found out years later, of course, at that time, we knew that our people got them from infected smallpox blankets, or blankets that were infected with smallpox. But we find out years later, thanks to Bill Clinton, President of the United States, that was actually the United States' first use of biological warfare on the Blackfoot people. They purposefully sent out these blankets, knowing that the Blackfoot, having no immunity to any of these diseases, would get sick. And they were right. And in fact, thousands, in fact, 1/3 of all the Blackfoot speaking peoples on this continent ceased to exist in that 1 year. So that's 1/3. If you're looking at that number, it could have been anywhere from 210,000 people. And if that was the case, that would have meant 70,000 people would have died in that 1 year. But that's what how they measured the deaths that happened to the tribes in those days. They didn't use hundreds or even thousands. They used terms like half, a third, or a quarter, or 2/3 of the people perished. So that's what happened in 1869. And this smallpox epidemic, it was huge. It affected the Blackfoot all across the spectrum, particularly our young, our warriors, our medicine people. All sorts of people died from the smallpox epidemic, and that seriously weakened the Blackfoot speaking peoples at that time, even militarily. So before they actually left, and I like to point this out, that when the white people came onto Blackfoot land, especially historically, when they came onto our land, they didn't just say, "This is mine now." If they wanted to trade or if they wanted to use any part of Blackfoot land in those days, long before there was any treaties, they always asked permission. So let's go back to this screen, this image here, if we could enlarge it. Thank you. So like before departing, these traders, they engaged a chief named Big Plume. Now he was a chief of the Gainawa, or the Blood tribe. So of these people, he was one of their chiefs, and he actually joined them from Sun River, where they left, and he joined them all the way into the British possessions. And the whole purpose was he wanted to keep them safe. So he accompanied these traders onto Blackfoot land. Now that's an interesting note, like I mentioned, because people didn't just come onto Blackfoot land, whether you were white or other tribes, and just try and take over an area, because then you'd have problems with the Blackfoot speaking peoples. But if you came onto the land and let the Blackfoot know why you're there and the reasons for it, then perhaps you can come to some sort of accommodation. And that's exactly what Healy and Hamilton did when they left the United States of America and came into the British possessions. They knew they were on Blackfoot land. And so instead of just making their way by blind chance, they took a member, and in this case a chief, and that was Chief Big Plume, and he joined them when they went to the Belly River region, where they eventually end up putting up their fort. But let's actually move on to the next image. A lot of people think that they set up their fort in 1869. They were still traveling. They didn't get into Canada until after 1870. And then in the early part of 1870, they actually set up their first Fort Whoop-Up, which was just a bunch of wagons set up in a semicircle with a few temporary buildings. It wasn't a fort yet. So they set up that in 1870. So they did not set it up in 1869 like a lot of people believe. They actually set up their fort in 1870. In 1869, around Christmas time or New Year's, they're actually still on the road. So it wasn't so let's get back actually into their journey. So their trip is pretty much uneventful until they reached the Marias River. And then when they got to the Marias River, they bumped into 20 Gainaquans. So Big Plume, he's a Gainaquan too. He bumps into 20 of his countrymen. But these people, they're all from the same tribe. They're with their head chief. And this was Bull Backfat. Now Bull Backfat, he was one of the biggest chiefs of the Blackfoot Confederacy at that time. And he was really well known as well, along with another chief, and I mentioned him. That was seen from afar. So they were the head chiefs of the Blood tribe, or the Gaina, the many leaders people. Well, Hamilton and Healy met Bull Backfat, and then he brought them the rest of their way. And interesting note is that when he bumped into Bull Backfat, they were starving. They had no food. These traders took him in, they fed his people, and for that, Bull Backfat took them all the way to the confluence of the Belly and the St. Mary's River, as they're known today. And it's when they reached there, that's where they decided to put up that fort. But here's an interesting note too. They couldn't just put up their fort anywhere they wanted, even traveling with two big chiefs, as big as Bull's Backfat and as big as Big Plume. Even with those two big chiefs accompanying him, Hamilton and Healy couldn't just put up their fort. They had to get the permission of the person on whose lands they were on. So let's move on to the next image. Now, this place that they end up putting up, Fort Whoop-Up, as they called it, this was actually known to the Blackfoot people as an area that they knew as Many Died, because in 1836, the first big smallpox epidemic to just truly do a number on the Blackfoot people, and that smallpox epidemic wiped out 2/3 of all the Blackfoot speaking peoples on this continent. Now, who knows how huge the original number was of Blackfoot people before diseases, but these diseases, like I said, took out fractions of our people. And in 1836, 2/3 of our people passed away. And even as this far north, the whole area where the confluence of the St. Mary's and the Waterton rivers are, it was littered with the dead from that epidemic. So the whole area was known as Many Died. I wanted to finish kind of mentioning that this smallpox epidemic, this lasted 4 years. It wasn't a year long like some people think. This lasted 4 years, the smallpox epidemic. And so this is the region there, if you take a look at that map, just kind of where it says Fort Whoop-Up. This is where they actually set up their camp. So you can see how far they traveled south from the United States of America until eventually, with bullback fat and with big plume, they reached the confluence of those rivers. But once they reached these rivers and they wanted to set up their fort, they had to get the permission of that chief. So let's move on to the next image. Now, when they arrived here, they sought out a man named Many Spotted Horses. Now, this is another great blood chief, and these are great names coming out of this time, because to the Blackfoot speaking peoples, these people accomplished so much, not just in warfare, but just in family and they're a big part of the Blackfoot history, our stories, especially in that century. Well, this particular chief, Many Spotted Horses, he was a leading chief of the Gaina. So all of these chiefs that were there, Big Plume, Bull's Back Fat, Many Spotted Horses, they would have known each other, and they probably were related. Well, these people all met, and they asked Many Spotted Horses permission to put their fort there, and he gave it. And also it said that he also gave Healy, his daughter or his sister, as a wife. And now the traders, they called these winter wives, because a lot of these traders had wives at home, back wherever they came from. But because they were out in the wilderness for so long, that was their excuse for finding a winter wife. And usually they found a winter wife amongst the tribesmen that they visited. And in a lot of cases, the white man's winter wife became his real wife, his wedded wife. But in a lot of cases, usually they only stayed with the women for as long as the time that they were out here in the wilderness, and then they left them. So that's kind of what happened with Healy's wife. He had his wife, Mary Frances, back on Sun River, but he also had the sister of Many Spotted Horses, or the daughter, as his wife as well. So the Blackfoot would look at him differently. And in fact, I think a lot of traders wanted these wives because it opened trade relations with the tribe, especially if you were married into a particular family like what happened in this case. So they asked this man's permission before they set up their camps, before they set up their Fort Whoop-Up. And that permission was given, and that's history. Once that was given, that became sort of the beginning of the history of the white people in southern Alberta. So I just kind of like to point that out too. I mentioned that earlier, but these traders coming from the United States of America, Hamilton and Healy, they arrived at the confluence of those rivers in January. So they were actually living in teepees, or what people know as teepees. You know, I like to point that out. To the Blackfoot, we say mois or nitois when we're talking about those type of dwellings. And we believed, like I mentioned in earlier programs, that it was our mothers and grandmothers who invented these types of dwellings. The word teepee is actually a Sioux word, so we'll try not to use that here. But that's what the people were living in. They were living in leather lodges during this time because it was too cold to put up a fort. So they were living out of their wagons. So the first Fort Hamilton and Fort Healy, or Fort Whoop-Up, it was actually just a rundown sort of like wagons and shacks and makeshift sort of a camp. And this is what they sold out of the back of their wagons, the trade goods that they came in with. And They made incredible profits. They practically sold everything they came into Blackfoot country with. And then they reported back to Fort Benton the incredible profits they made. And that changed things. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's move on to the next image. Now, the original post that they built, it was called Fort Hamilton. And like I mentioned, it was consisted of 11 log huts. And they were arranged like in the form of a semicircle. And as it states here, it was connected by a picket fence. And so it was running like an arc from one river to the other river. Because you got to remember, their first fort was at the confluence. So basically, at the confluence, this is where the first Fort Whoop-Up was. But you know, as soon as the people left this area and they went back to Fort Benton, the first Fort Whoop-Up was promptly burnt down. This post, it didn't last. The Blackfoot may have burnt it down, or it may have just been burned down as part of a prairie fire, but all we know is that the first Fort Whoop-Up was burnt down to the ground. And in fact, what you're looking at here in the picture there, that's sort of where the first Fort Whoop-Up was built. Now it's just a bunch of scrub with brush and everything with a few markers there. But that was the original Fort Hamilton that was built when Hamilton and Healy first came out to Blackfoot country from the United States of America. Now we know where they set up camp, here in the British North America, as they called it, right outside the town of Lethbridge. And what we're going to do is in the next episode, we're going to talk about the whoop-up trade, the whiskey trade that affected southern Alberta, particularly the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples, and then it ended with the arrival of the Northwest Mounted Police. That'll be our next broadcast, just so you know. But from here, I think I can let everybody go, and we thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So in the meantime, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Thank you.